On August 4, 1943, fog rolled thick across the moorland surrounding Bovington Camp in Dorset. Major General A.C. Richardson sat at his desk, pen moving deliberately across a document stamped with bold red letters reading "Most Secret." Each word he wrote documented what would become one of Britain's most humbling military embarrassments. "The reliability test commences today," his pen recorded. "Three nations' tanks will travel 2,000 miles across our homeland. Only a single machine will prove itself worthy of modern combat." That prediction would weigh heavily on everyone involved in the weeks to come. Through the swirling mist that blanketed the parade ground, 11 tanks stood ready. Engines rumbled to life with distinctly different characters. 3 American M4A2 Shermans, powered by General Motors diesel engines, hummed with mechanical precision and industrial efficiency. 3 M4A4 Shermans, sporting Chrysler multi-bank petrol engines, produced a steadier, more familiar rhythm. 3 British Cromwell Mark I cruiser tanks, equipped with the new Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, emitted powerful growls, though troubling vibrations suggested underlying concerns. 2 Cromwell Mark III variants added their voices to the mechanical chorus, supposedly representing improvements to the design. Finally, 3 Centaur Mark I tanks with their aging Liberty engines coughed and sputtered ominously. As crews scrambled aboard their assigned machines, few realized they were about to participate in what would eventually be called World War II's most definitive tank reliability comparison. None suspected that this exercise would expose fundamental truths about how different nations approached weapons manufacturing. The Americans had pursued reliability and mass production, sacrificing raw performance to ensure consistent operation. The British had chased speed and theoretical superiority, prioritizing impressive specifications over dependable functionality. Over the following 7 weeks, Exercise Dracula would determine which philosophy actually won wars. The numbers would prove brutal for British morale. The consequences would fundamentally alter British armoured doctrine for the war's remainder. And the lessons would influence military procurement thinking for decades afterward, long after the final shots of World War II echoed into silence. Yet Exercise Dracula's origins lay not in this English countryside, but in the searing heat of North Africa, where British tankers had experienced a profound crisis. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, British cruiser tanks had developed a sinister reputation for mechanical failure at the worst conceivable moments. The Crusader tank, despite boasting a theoretical maximum speed of 26 miles per hour that should have granted British forces superior mobility, spent more time stranded beside desert tracks than advancing toward enemy lines. Oil seeped continuously from the Liberty engines powering most British cruisers. Cooling systems, engineered for temperate British conditions, catastrophically failed beneath the African sun, where internal tank temperatures frequently exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Transmissions fractured under punishment from sandy terrain and constant tactical maneuvering. Electrical systems corroded in dusty conditions. Tank crews routinely carried extensive spare parts as standard kit and braced themselves for breakdowns that left them vulnerable and deeply frustrated. British tankers watched with mounting frustration as American-supplied M4 Sherman tanks, flowing into Britain through the Lend-Lease program in ever-growing quantities, demonstrated reliability that British industry simply could not match. Shermans lacked the theoretical speed of British cruisers on paper, approximately 25 miles per hour, compared to the Crusader's 26, or the Cromwell's eventual 40 miles per hour. Yet they started reliably each morning, something British tank crews could never assume. They operated continuously without breakdown. They demanded minimal maintenance, freeing crews for other responsibilities. They failed less frequently, ensuring more vehicles remained combat-ready at any moment. Most critically, they simply functioned when combat demanded, fighting rather than languishing in repair yards. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding British forces in North Africa and later Northwest Europe, privately noted that American tanks could be depended upon, while British designs remained temperamental at best and dangerously unreliable at worst. London's War Office faced a crisis threatening British industrial prestige. Years of development, decades of accumulated expertise, and concentrated effort from Britain's finest minds had produced disappointing designs that failed in actual combat. The Covenanter, unveiled in 1941 as the next-generation cruiser tank, proved so unreliable that despite manufacturing over 1,100 units at considerable expense, it never saw combat deployment. The cooling system failed so persistently that the tank proved essentially unusable in temperatures warmer than a British autumn. The Crusader, which did see extensive combat, proved marginally better, but remained plagued by chronic mechanical troubles that frustrated crews needing trustworthy equipment. The Cavalier, initially designated 24 Cromwell Mark the Funds before naming conventions changed, inherited the same flawed Liberty engine and was quickly relegated to training roles after tests demonstrated no improvement over predecessors. Britain desperately required a cruiser tank that functioned reliably during actual combat. The answer appeared to come from Rolls-Royce, the company renowned for producing the world's finest automobiles and having successfully transitioned to aircraft engine manufacturing. Senior designer W.A. Robotham had brilliantly adapted the celebrated Merlin aircraft engine, the power plant that drove Spitfires and Hurricanes to victory during the Battle of Britain, into a tank engine christened the Meteor. This 600-horsepower V12 promised the power and reliability that every previous British tank design lacked. The Merlin had demonstrated supreme reliability in aircraft, running hundreds of hours between major servicing. Surely British engineers reasoned that same dependability would transfer to tank operations. When installed in the A27M hull, it created the officially designated tank cruiser Mark VII Cromwell. Early trials revealed genuinely impressive performance. The Cromwell achieved speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour on test courses, making it Britain's fastest tank and among the world's quickest. Production commenced in January 1943 across multiple British manufacturing facilities. Leyland Motors in Lancashire, Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, Metro Camel, English Electric, and others ramped up for mass production of what everyone hoped would finally answer German armoured superiority. By summer 1943, hundreds of Cromwells rolled from assembly lines. Production accelerated toward totals that would equip entire armoured divisions. The War Office planned equipping British divisions with this machine, finally ending embarrassing dependence on American vehicles. British tankers would receive a homegrown machine combining impressive speed, adequate 75mm firepower, reasonable armour, and hopefully the dependability that had eluded previous designs. Yet doubts persisted among those closest to the tanks. Early reports from training units receiving initial production, Cromwell's mentioned troubling issues that sounded distressingly familiar. Oil seepage around the engine compartment created fire hazards and left visible trails that enemy reconnaissance aircraft could spot from considerable distances. Clutch failures during extended operations left tanks immobilized in training exercises, raising terrifying questions about what combat stress would cause. Steering difficulties that crews described as unreliable and alarming, with tanks sometimes refusing to respond to driver commands. These problems emerged during controlled training with abundant spare parts and skilled mechanics nearby. What would happen during prolonged combat operations far from supply depots? The War Office needed definitive answers before fully committing to the Cromwell as Britain's primary cruiser tank. In July 1943, senior British military leadership authorized a comprehensive reliability test to settle the matter conclusively. Exercise Dracula would directly compare new British tanks against proven American Shermans that had proven themselves across North Africa, Sicily, and increasingly in Italy following the July invasion. The test would be a 2,000-mile endurance trial across Britain's length and breadth, simulating prolonged campaign demands. Tanks would navigate varied terrain, including paved roads, dirt tracks, and cross-country movement. They would operate through all conditions a British autumn offered: rain, mud, temperature fluctuations. Vehicles would be maintained under field conditions using standard procedures and tools available to combat units without specialized factory equipment or civilian technicians. Results would determine whether the Cromwell deserved frontline service or required additional development time Britain could ill afford in the war's fifth year. Test parameters received meticulous establishment, ensuring complete fairness. All tanks would be standard production models drawn directly from assembly lines, not specially prepared prototypes. Experienced British crews trained on both British and American equipment would eliminate crew familiarity as a variable. Maintenance would follow standard procedures, using only tools available to forward units. Every vehicle would travel identical routes, face identical challenges, operate under identical constraints. Every defect, regardless of size, would be meticulously recorded. Every maintenance hour would be logged and analyzed. The test would provide objective evidence regarding which tanks could genuinely be trusted when reliability meant survival. 3 tank types would compete. The Sherman M4A2 used General Motors twin diesel engines specifically chosen by American designers for exceptional reliability and fuel economy. The Sherman M4A4 employed the Chrysler A57 multi-bank engine, ingeniously consisting of 5 automobile engines joined into a single power plant. Both Sherman variants had already proven themselves in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. American crews trusted them completely. British personnel transitioning from British tanks to Shermans praised them consistently. The Cromwell Mark I and Mark III represented Britain's latest cruiser technology, powered by the Meteor engine derived from the Merlin and equipped with 75mm guns, using identical ammunition to the Sherman for logistical convenience. The Centaur Mark I, powered by the outdated Liberty engine that had failed in previous designs, served as a baseline comparison representing older British technology the Cromwell intended to supersede. Exercise Dracula's first 10 days focused entirely on preparation at Bovington Camp, the British Army's primary armoured training facility. Mechanics thoroughly inspected each tank, methodically reviewing systems to ensure all vehicles began the test in proper condition. Any existing defects were identified and corrected. Crews familiarized themselves with their assigned vehicles, learning individual characteristics and peculiarities. Officers established detailed maintenance protocols and meticulous recording procedures that would remain constant throughout. Everything received careful documentation, creating a comprehensive baseline. Competitive spirit grew evident as training progressed. British crews desperately wanted their homegrown tanks to triumph over American machines, validating years of British development efforts. Sherman crews, many possessing combat experience in North Africa and capable of comparing their tanks favorably to earlier British equipment, expressed quiet confidence, their experience fully justified. On August 15, 1943, Exercise Dracula began in earnest. The 11 tanks departed Bovington Camp in early morning light, heading northward on a carefully planned route threading through England's heart, up into Scotland, across toward Wales, and eventually back to Dorset. The journey would span approximately 2,000 miles across 4 weeks, with planned stops at various military installations along the way. The daily routine became grueling and relentless. Paved roads gave way to open fields and moorland, while simulated combat scenarios pushed the tanks to their absolute limits. Rain soaked the landscape, mud caked the tracks, cold nights bit through layers of clothing. Occasionally the weather would clear, offering a brief respite before the next downpour. Every evening at designated stops, crews scrambled to maintain their machines. Every single defect got recorded by observers who watched like hawks, documenting every problem, no matter how small. The first signs of trouble came almost immediately. Within just hours of rolling out, one Centaur began spewing smoke from its engine bay before the column had even covered 10 miles. That ancient Liberty engine was already gasping under the strain of continuous operation. By the time the formation pulled into its first evening stop north of London, that same tank had sprung a serious oil leak. The crew and mechanics worked frantically for 2 solid hours just to keep the machine running. A Cromwell hit major brake trouble while descending a steep hill on the northern route. The brakes were fading fast, and the driver had to wrestle it into low gears just to maintain control. The Shermans rolled into that first stop without incident, their crews handling routine evening checks with practiced efficiency. Meanwhile, the observers kept meticulous notes, recording every problem, every delay. Patterns were starting to emerge. By week's end, the picture had become unmistakably clear. The Centaurs consistently limped in hours after everyone else, their crews completely exhausted from fighting mechanical gremlins all day long. Night after night meant emergency repairs that kept mechanics working until they could barely stand. The Liberty engines wept oil constantly, leaving dark stains across the roads and creating chronic pressure problems. Cooling systems struggled desperately to manage the heat pouring from sustained engine operation, forcing frequent stops to prevent catastrophic overheating. Clutches slipped under load, making gear changes agonizing or impossible. One Centaur needed 8 grueling hours of maintenance in a single night. Crews worked by torchlight, pushing themselves to exhaustion just to keep their tank viable enough to continue. The competitive spirit that had marked the exercise's beginning had evaporated completely. What remained was grim, desperate determination to simply survive another day's movement without being pulled from the exercise altogether. The Cromwells performed noticeably better than the struggling Centaurs, yet still fell dramatically short of what British designers had envisioned. Oil leaked around engine seals with alarming frequency, demanding constant attention from crews who desperately needed rest. The brake systems couldn't handle a tank capable of 40 miles per hour, with brake fade occurring dangerously on long stretches that left drivers fighting for control. Clutch failures grew increasingly common as the exercise dragged on, traced by mechanics to poor design that couldn't handle the Meteor engine's substantial power output. Steering remained problematic despite modifications, with crews reporting consistent difficulty maintaining direction through rough cross-country terrain. What troubled British leadership most was this revelation. These weren't new problems at all. The observers were explicit about it. These defects had appeared in early testing and should have been fixed during development before production ever started. The Sherman tanks, by absolute contrast, operated with almost boring mechanical consistency that impressed even the most skeptical British crews. Every morning they started reliably. That simple fact alone meant something remarkable to soldiers who had grown accustomed to temperamental British equipment that might or might not cooperate on any given day. The Shermans maintained their scheduled speeds without the constant drama. When maintenance became necessary, which wasn't often, it was routine and predictable rather than frantic emergency repairs consuming entire nights. The diesel-powered M4A2 proved particularly robust, with one experienced crew remarking that the engine seemed almost indestructible even under brutal sustained use. The multi-bank M4A4 required slightly more attention due to its more intricate design, yet still massively outperformed British tanks across every reliability metric. American engineering philosophy had triumphed decisively. They prioritized simple, dependable design over flashy specifications that looked impressive on paper but failed in practice. Captain Priestley of the Coldstream Guards documented something often overlooked: the human cost of mechanical failure. Cromwell crews should theoretically have had things easiest, since their tanks were the fastest and should arrive first at each evening halt. Reality proved entirely different. 1 or 2 Cromwells routinely showed up late at night, disabled by breakdowns along the way and time-consuming repairs. That meant cold meals waiting for exhausted crews. Guides stood shivering in darkness for hours. Fuel trucks stood idle when they were needed elsewhere. Sleep vanished for countless personnel far beyond just the tank crews themselves. Unreliability created ripples that spread throughout the entire unit, damaging efficiency and morale in ways that defied easy calculation, yet remained painfully obvious. As September arrived and the exercise approached completion, after covering nearly 2,000 miles, the statistics being compiled told a story that would shake British confidence to its core. The observers had tracked everything meticulously: every defect, every maintenance hour, every system failure on every tank. The data became comprehensive tables and detailed charts reserved for only the highest military and political leadership. The implications would prove profound and deeply humiliating for British tank production that had consumed enormous resources. The 3 Sherman M4A2 tanks covered nearly 14,000 miles combined, exceeding the planned distance because they served as formation pacesetters. They accumulated roughly 19 defects total across all 3 machines during the entire exercise, averaging about 66 defects per tank. Specialist mechanics invested 420 hours keeping all three operational, averaging 140 hours per tank across the complete exercise. That worked out to just 0.03 hours of maintenance per mile traveled, or about 2 minutes of maintenance for every mile driven. These machines were nearly maintenance-free by armored vehicle standards, requiring only routine servicing and occasional minor repairs that crews completed quickly. The reliability astounded observers monitoring such complex machines operating under difficult conditions far from factory support. The three Sherman M4A4 tanks showed slightly elevated maintenance demands due to their more complex multi-bank engines combining 5 automobile power plants, yet still demonstrated impressive reliability, surpassing British equipment. Their statistics mirrored the diesel variants closely enough that the official report treated all 6 American tanks as collectively demonstrating superior reliability without question. The Sherman tanks proved decisively that American engineering worked in practice. Simple, robust designs with adequate, rather than spectacular performance created tanks that operated consistently when the situation demanded it. By comparison, the 5 Cromwell tanks covered barely 11,000 miles while experiencing 367 defects total. Significantly more problems despite covering less distance. Specialist mechanics labored 840 hours maintaining the Cromwells, nearly double the Sherman requirement. That corresponded to 0.07 hours of maintenance per mile, more than double the Sherman figure for the same distance. Every mile in a Cromwell meant more than 4 minutes of maintenance compared to 2 minutes for a Sherman. The difference between 0.03 and 0.07 hours per mile seemed trivial in abstract statistical terms, yet translated directly to Cromwell tanks, requiring more than twice the maintenance time that Shermans needed for equivalent distances traveled. In actual campaign conditions, Sherman-equipped units could advance farther and faster because they spent dramatically less time fixing broken machines. The 3 Centaur tanks performed even worse, confirming widespread suspicions. They covered only 8,400 miles due to constant breakdowns that frequently left tanks immobilized for extended periods. The Centaurs accumulated over 2,000 defects total and required 742 maintenance hours, approaching Cromwell totals despite covering far less distance. That worked out to 0.087 hours per mile, nearly 3 times the Sherman requirement and making the Centaur the worst performer across every single category. The Liberty engine simply couldn't handle what a modern tank demanded. The Centaur was clearly a failed design kept in production merely to sustain factory output while Meteor engine production ramped upward. The exercise proved definitively what many had suspected. The Centaur should never have been built and represented massive waste of scarce industrial resources. Major General Richardson's final report pulled absolutely no punches about British failures. The simplicity and reliability of the American machines, in contrast with British production, stands as the chief lesson of Dracula, he wrote with unmistakable clarity. The Cromwell could undoubtedly become an equally good fighting vehicle, but redesigning necessary should prioritize simplicity, which would bring reliability. The report noted precisely that a commander with Sherman tanks could genuinely expect 99% of vehicles reaching battle, at least during the first 2,000 miles of operational life. A commander equipped with Cromwell or Centaur tanks would exist in continuous anxiety about whether sufficient machines would actually reach the battlefield to accomplish expected tasks. The observers added crucial context, making British performance look worse still. Exercise Dracula operated under conditions remarkably favorable to the machines, particularly the less reliable ones, the report stated frankly. Long distances were covered, but the squadron always reached harbour in time to perform maintenance in daylight with adequate facilities. Even so, British machines stayed operational only through tremendous hard work by dedicated crews and mechanics. Such favourable conditions would never exist during actual combat operations. Less favourable conditions encountered in sustained campaign fighting would severely damage reliability and battle effectiveness. In other words, the Cromwell's already poor performance in this controlled exercise would deteriorate significantly under actual combat conditions with enemy pressure, limited maintenance time, and difficult supply situations. Alec Richardson of the British Tank Mission, monitoring separate American testing of British tanks, wrote a scathingly candid assessment in October 1943. "These tanks have made us a laughingstock out here," he wrote regarding Cromwell and Centaur machines sent to American proving grounds. "The Cromwell has had a variety of troubles that keep appearing. The Americans are politely indifferent to what happens to them, which is perhaps worse than open criticism. The Rolls-Royce representative is deeply unhappy and wants them withdrawn immediately to avoid further embarrassment. We are undoubtedly the world's worst salesman when it comes to tanks," he concluded bluntly. "Send no more British tanks to America until they are genuinely reliable and can compete with American equipment. We must create first-class cruiser and light tanks at home, however long it takes getting the design right. We must regain our prestige and reputation for quality engineering." British engineers well understood the causes of Cromwell unreliability. The Meteor engine, though powerful and relatively dependable compared to the disastrous Liberty, was fundamentally an aircraft engine adapted for tank use. Aircraft engines operate at fairly constant speeds under steady conditions without experiencing the reverse torque and constant speed variations that tank engines must endure during tactical maneuvers. The aircraft-to-tank adaptation proved imperfect and showed in reliability problems. Oil seals designed for aircraft use leaked under different pressure conditions in tank operation. Cooling systems perfectly adequate for aircraft, where cooling airflows constantly struggled within the confined tank space and highly varied cooling demands of tank installation. The engine was magnificent in principle and impressive on paper, but problematic in actual field execution. Transmission and running gear problems stemmed directly from inadequate development time before production began. The Merritt-Brown gearbox was sophisticated and provided good performance, but also complex with more failure points than simpler American transmission designs. The brakes were clearly undersized for a 40-mile-per-hour tank, causing dangerous brake fade during sustained use on long descents. The clutch wasn't robust enough to handle the Meteor's substantial torque output reliably. The suspension, largely inherited from earlier cruiser designs, was stressed well beyond its original design limits by the Cromwell's increased weight and high-speed capability. Each system worked adequately in isolation during static testing, yet proved vulnerable when stressed by actual sustained operational conditions. The fundamental problem was philosophical and struck at the heart of British versus American engineering approaches. British tank design prioritized speed and firepower above everything else, viewing reliability as a secondary concern addressable through skilled maintenance by trained crews. This philosophy worked in peacetime when tanks operated from established bases with ample logistical support and specialized maintenance readily available. It failed catastrophically in wartime when tanks had to operate far from rear depots with severely limited spare parts, under continuous operational stress without adequate rest periods. The Americans, by deliberate contrast, designed for reliability first, consciously accepting modest performance specifications if it meant the tank would operate consistently when needed. Their philosophy proved decisively superior in practice when tested under realistic operational conditions. The grueling trials of Exercise Dracula forced British military planners to take a hard look at how they were building tanks and what they actually valued in tank design. Everything they thought they knew about tank production had to change. The Cromwell underwent a complete overhaul based on what the exercise had revealed about its serious weaknesses. Engineers tackled the persistent oil leaks that had plagued the machine, installing improved seals engineered specifically for the demands tanks would face in actual combat conditions. The brake system received a complete redesign from the ground up, with components substantially larger in capacity to handle stopping a machine of that weight and power reliably. The clutch parts were significantly strengthened to work dependably with the engine's output over extended periods. The suspension system got thorough attention, with engineers working methodically to eliminate the chronic failure points that had caused so much trouble during the exercise. Getting all these improvements right consumed many months of intense work. Production processes at multiple factories had to change significantly to accommodate the modifications. The final production specification that Leyland Motors designated as the Battle Cromwell wasn't ready until February 2, 1944, after incorporating countless smaller refinements alongside the major reliability improvements addressing the tank's core problems. A second round of rigorous testing in November 1943 showed real progress, with the modified Cromwell performing noticeably better than it had that August. The improved versions worked considerably better than their predecessors, though they still couldn't quite match what the Sherman could reliably deliver across all performance measures. The Centaur, by contrast, showed virtually no meaningful improvement despite serious modification efforts, and was essentially written off as unsuitable for frontline combat. The Liberty engine simply didn't have the raw power needed for a tank of that weight. No amount of engineering work could fix such a fundamental design problem. Most Centaurs ended up in training roles where their unreliability caused less damage, or were converted into specialized vehicles instead, getting new roles as armored recovery machines, observation posts for artillery, or engineering vehicles with their turrets removed and bulldozer blades installed for construction tasks. The Cromwell eventually reached combat units in June 1944, equipping the reconnaissance regiments of several British and Polish divisions for Operation Overlord, the massive invasion of Normandy. In actual combat, the tank proved genuinely quick and responsive, with an impressively low silhouette that made it genuinely difficult for enemy crews to spot and target from distance. Military observers praised these characteristics enthusiastically, but reliability remained persistently troublesome compared to Sherman-equipped units. Cromwells needed more maintenance work every single day they operated. Unit commanders carried greater quantities of spare parts to manage the higher failure rates they experienced constantly. The 75mm gun matched the Sherman's main armament exactly and fired identical ammunition, providing logistical convenience and adequate firepower against most German tanks. However, it struggled significantly when facing the thick armor protecting Tigers and Panthers. The Cromwell's greatest strengths in combat became speed and concealment, allowing it to sidestep prolonged firefights where its gunpowder and protective armor proved inadequate. Beyond the narrow technical questions about tank design itself, Exercise Dracula taught a far broader lesson. The trials proved conclusively that reliability wasn't merely a pleasant feature or something nice to have. It represented genuine military capability that directly determined how effectively forces could fight. An unreliable tank might as well not exist if it cannot arrive at the battle when needed. A moderately capable tank that functions consistently and predictably defeats a theoretically superior tank that breaks down constantly in every realistic assessment of combat worth. The Americans grasped this fundamental truth instinctively and built their equipment from the ground up according to these principles. The British, shaped by centuries of engineering reputation and desire for cutting-edge capabilities, had to absorb this painful lesson through the humiliating public failure that Exercise Dracula represented. The Sherman tank that dominated the exercise against the Cromwell wasn't perfect by any measure. Its protective armor was clearly insufficient against the German Panther and Tiger, armed with powerful high-velocity guns. The 75mm gun lacked penetrating power against thick armor at the distances actual combat occurred. Troops called it a Zippo after the famous cigarette lighter brand, joking that it ignited the first time every time, a grim reference to the tank's unfortunate habit of catching fire rapidly when enemy shells pierced its hull. Polish soldiers serving in British units called it the burning grave, an even darker description of the same terrifying reality. These represented genuinely severe, deadly flaws that claimed many lives. Yet the Sherman stayed in full production and continued equipping frontline divisions throughout the war and long after, precisely because it functioned reliably. The Sherman achieved success not through superior tank versus tank fighting ability, but through dependable operation and manufacturing capacity that put overwhelming numbers of them everywhere needed. American factories produced an astounding 49,324 Shermans between 1942 and 1946, an industrial accomplishment no other Western tank design matched. The tank could be built quickly and efficiently across American factories spread throughout the country. It could be shipped overseas effectively aboard the Liberty ships that formed the foundation of Allied supply lines. It could be serviced in the field by ordinary maintenance personnel using standard tools and techniques available to regular units. When combat destroyed or damaged a Sherman, replacement tanks arrived within days or sometimes hours. Recovery teams and repair shops returned damaged vehicles to fighting condition rapidly, frequently within 24 hours of a tank suffering damage. This complete industrial and logistical approach to armored warfare proved vastly more valuable than any amount of technical sophistication in individual tank design. The production figures tell a revealing story about industrial thinking and strategic choices. Germany manufactured roughly 6,000 Panther tanks and approximately 1,300 Tigers during the entire war, vehicles that were technically superior to the Sherman in armor thickness and gun firepower. However, German tanks suffered from excessive engineering complexity, featuring unnecessarily tight tolerances, consuming tremendous time and resources to manufacture, and demanding intensive maintenance in field operations. They required specialized components manufactured at specific facilities. They needed expert mechanics with extensive training. They failed frequently under the grinding demands of sustained combat operations. A German panzer division attempting the rapid 400-mile advance across France that Sherman-equipped American divisions accomplished routinely in summer 1944 would have left destroyed and broken machines scattered across the countryside long before reaching Paris. The French army learned this lesson after the war when they tried operating captured Panthers in service, discovering they were practically impossible to keep functioning, proving far less dependable than the American Shermans that remained in French service into the 1950s. Soviet forces received 4,100 Shermans through Lend-Lease and developed surprising respect for the American design. Soviet tank crews, familiar with the notoriously harsh T-34, which worked effectively but offered brutal discomfort, found the American tank remarkably comfortable by comparison. The Sherman featured rubber tracks that lasted twice as long as T-34 steel tracks and ran much more quietly, a meaningful tactical advantage. The crew compartment was substantially roomier and more comfortable for its occupants. The Sherman even featured padded seats, an almost inconceivable luxury in Soviet tank philosophy that prioritized production numbers over crew comfort. From the Soviet perspective, the real advantage was the Sherman's genuine dependability. It started reliably without the temperamental difficulties of Soviet machines. It ran consistently without the constant mechanical crises and emergency repairs Soviet crews expected constantly. Soviet tank commander Dmitry Losa, who documented his combat experiences extensively, observed that unguarded damaged Shermans would be stripped for usable parts within minutes by other Soviet crews, clear evidence that Soviet tankers genuinely preferred American reliability over their own equipment. The reliability advantage translated directly into movement speed and campaign success. Sherman-equipped divisions could cover greater distances faster than German opponents, not because of superior top speed, but because of dramatically better mechanical uptime and actual availability. A Sherman-equipped armored division could realistically advance 40 miles daily for extended weeks with minimal losses to mechanical breakdown. A German panzer division attempting that same operational tempo would lose more tanks to mechanical failure than to enemy action, steadily weakening until unable to function effectively. This core advantage allowed Allied forces to exploit breakthroughs, maintain momentum during rapid campaigns, and keep enemies constantly struggling to respond in ways German forces simply could not manage by 1944, after years of grinding warfare had thoroughly exhausted German equipment. Historian David Fletcher, curator at the Tank Museum in Bovington and Britain's leading expert on British armour, captured the Sherman's fundamental value with simple eloquence. It would always start in the morning, it would go all day without drama. This unglamorous, unremarkable dependability made it the crucial workhorse of Allied armour across every combat zone. British tankers might have personally cherished the Cromwell's remarkable speed or yearned for the Firefly's more powerful 17-pounder gun, but they genuinely relied on the fundamental Sherman to function day after day without failure. American tankers complained frequently about the Sherman's obvious shortcomings against German heavy tanks, but they knew absolutely that it would not strand them defenseless behind enemy lines through unexpected mechanical failure. Reliability wasn't exciting or glamorous, but it won battles by ensuring troops arrived prepared to fight, not delayed beside roads fixing engines. The Cromwell followed a different path than originally intended. It entered frontline service too late to become Britain's main cruiser tank replacement. The entire A27 series production totaled 4,610 tanks, including 950 Centaurs and 366 Cromwells. This represented just a small percentage of the over 49,000 Shermans American factories built. The dramatic difference reflected hard realities. British industry simply lacked the production capacity of America, while simultaneously building Royal Navy vessels, Royal Air Force aircraft, and countless other weapons for theatres across the globe. The Cromwell equipped mainly the specialised reconnaissance regiments of British and Polish armoured divisions, where speed and agility mattered more than large quantities or unshakable reliability. The celebrated 7th Armoured Division, known worldwide as the Desert Rats after their North African campaigns, used Cromwells extensively in reconnaissance work. The 11th Armoured Division fielded Cromwell-equipped reconnaissance battalions that capitalised on the tank's speed advantage. The Guards Armoured Division employed Cromwells effectively for scouting and flanking missions. The 1st Polish Armoured Division received Cromwells and operated them skillfully throughout Northwest Europe campaigns. In these specialised reconnaissance roles, where the mission suited the tank's particular strengths, the Cromwell performed quite capably. The impressively low profile and remarkable high speed let reconnaissance units scout effectively ahead of main forces, engage targets of opportunity when conditions favoured it, and escape rapidly when encountering larger German forces. Experienced Cromwell crews created sophisticated tactics that systematically exploited their advantages while minimizing exposure to their weaknesses. They used speed to avoid sustained firefights where inadequate gunpowder and armor would prove fatal. They employed low profile and superior agility to maintain concealment, observing enemy positions without being detected. They used superior maneuverability to flank slower German tanks and strike vulnerable rear areas, where even the 75mm gun achieved penetration. The Cromwell discovered its tactical role not as a main battle tank, but as a specialized reconnaissance vehicle, where speed and stealth provided more value than sustained reliability or heavy firepower. When European warfare ended in May 1945, Cromwells remained active in British military service, continuing into the 1950s. Testament to the successful improvements made after Exercise Dracula exposed its critical flaws. The tanks saw combat again in Korea with the 7th Royal Tank Regiment and 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars during that conflict. British forces deployed Cromwells together with newer Centurion tanks beginning to enter service. The tank was distributed to various Allied nations, rebuilding militaries after the war. Australia, Austria, Finland, Israel, Jordan, and other countries operated Cromwells in different roles. Some Cromwells received major upgrades with more powerful 20-pounder guns, creating the Challenger tank destroyer that served as a useful interim solution until the Centurion tank eventually equipped British armoured units in the late 1950s. The Cromwell's extended post-war service proved convincingly that the improvements made after Exercise Dracula successfully resolved its reliability problems. The tank that had deeply embarrassed Britain in August 1943 became dependable enough for continued frontline service more than a decade afterward. The Sherman, meanwhile, fought effectively in virtually every World War II theatre, from North Africa and Italy, across Northwest Europe, and throughout Pacific Island campaigns and China. After the war ended, it continued serving in armies of many nations through the Korean War, where it held its own against Soviet-supplied T-34-85s. It saw action in numerous Arab-Israeli wars, where both sides operated Shermans from different sources. It participated in Indo-Pakistani conflicts, where its dependability proved crucial. The tank fought in various regional conflicts throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. Israel became perhaps the most devoted post-war Sherman operator, extensively modernizing the design with new engines, enhanced armor, and more powerful guns. Israeli modified Shermans fought effectively in the 1967-68 war and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, demonstrating the fundamental design remained viable decades after introduction. The last Chilean army units equipped with Shermans finally retired them only in 2003, 61 years after production began, making it among the longest-serving tank designs in military history. This exceptional longevity testified powerfully to the fundamental soundness of the core design and the lasting worth of reliability-focused engineering over chasing cutting-edge performance. Exercise Dracula's lessons extended far beyond tank design specifics to shape broader military procurement thinking. The trials proved conclusively that theoretical cutting-edge performance means nothing without underlying reliability to provide that performance when battles actually happen. Pursuing complexity for its own sake or chasing marginally improved specifications becomes a weakness rather than a strength. The capacity to produce equipment efficiently in large numbers and maintain it easily in field conditions matters far more than technical sophistication requiring specialized support. These difficult lessons influenced post-war British defense procurement philosophy, though not always for the better. The persistent hunger for technological advantage and cutting-edge capabilities frequently still outweighed practical demands for reliability and ease of maintenance. This resulted in numerous costly programs producing small quantities of sophisticated but problematic equipment that never achieved its intended results. The exercise Dracula test laid bare a massive industrial divide between American and British manufacturing that had grown dramatically by 1943. American factories had perfected the mass production methods Henry Ford originally pioneered in automobiles, then honed further through New Deal programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority. The British, despite centuries of industrial prestige, simply couldn't match American techniques using their existing factories and workforce methods. Quality control systems, standardized parts, and assembly line discipline had reached levels the British couldn't replicate. The Sherman prevailed partly because of thoughtful design choices, but equally because American industry could manufacture reliable tanks in staggering quantities. Britain struggled just to produce its own problematic designs in sufficient numbers for the war effort. Industrial capacity mattered just as much as engineering brilliance, perhaps even more so in a total war. Yet the human dimension of exercise Dracula carried particular significance, revealing truths about soldier psychology that went beyond any specific equipment characteristics. Tank crews didn't concern themselves with impressive theoretical numbers buried in technical specifications. What mattered to them was whether their tank actually fired up each morning, performed steadily through the day without problems, and brought them back alive at night. When a tank constantly failed during operations, crews developed a grim fatalism that poisoned their effectiveness and made them reluctant to take tactical chances. Conversely, crews who trusted their vehicle's dependability fought with real aggression and boldness, knowing the machine wouldn't betray them when stakes were highest. Exercise Dracula proved empirically that reliability shaped unit morale and combat performance in ways far deeper than simple mechanical statistics indicated. Tank soldiers could depend on created crews who fought harder and smarter. Unreliable machines produced anxious, hesitant soldiers who worried more about breakdowns than the enemy, fatally weakening their combat capability. In late September 1943, Exercise Dracula's comprehensive report reached the highest levels of British military and political command, including Winston Churchill. The lengthy document forced acknowledgement of serious failures in British tank development programs that had consumed enormous resources. This report directly reshaped British procurement strategy for the war's remainder. The Comet tank project, which would finally deliver a cruiser comparable to the German Panther, received dramatically expanded priority and funding. The findings also heavily influenced the strategic choice to continue relying substantially on Sherman tanks, rather than rushing the Cromwell into service when it still needed substantial development despite ongoing modifications. The raw numbers emerging from Exercise Dracula were harsh and completely unmistakable. The Sherman needed just 0.003 hours of maintenance per mile driven. The Cromwell demanded 0.07 hours per mile, more than double. The Centaur required 0.087 hours per mile, nearly triple the Sherman standard. These dry statistics translated into concrete operational realities that spelled the difference between battlefield success and failure. They meant literally that Sherman-equipped units could push farther each day and fight more effectively than Cromwell units covering identical distances. American engineering philosophy, reliable simplicity, had beaten British pursuit of sophisticated speed in the genuine test of continuous operations. Exercise Dracula ultimately addressed the chasm between impressive theory and battlefield reality. On paper, the Cromwell appeared superior to the Sherman, with its speed advantage, comparable firepower, and similar armor protection. In practice, under demanding realistic conditions, the Cromwell spent more than double its time in repair shops instead of fighting. Theory promised that advanced sophistication and cutting-edge performance would inevitably prevail. Practice showed conclusively that unglamorous reliability and straightforward robustness dominated when equipment operated far from comfortable rear depots. The 2,000-mile test definitively revealed which design philosophy actually functioned when tanks operated distant from support facilities under relentless operational pressure and combat stress without luxury maintenance time. 8 decades later, military forces worldwide still wrestle with Exercise Dracula's fundamental lessons. The seductive pull toward cutting-edge performance and eye-catching specifications remains irresistible, often at reliability's expense. Major weapons programs frequently prioritize sophisticated capabilities that impress in presentations over dependable strength that matters in sustained operations. The outcome typically involves small quantities of extraordinarily expensive, maintenance-heavy equipment that consistently underperforms less ambitious but more reliable alternatives in actual service. The Sherman versus Cromwell comparison offers lasting warning about the real penalties of prioritizing theoretical performance above practical reliability in military equipment decisions. British soldiers who personally participated in Exercise Dracula emerged with transformed perspectives on their equipment. Sherman crews felt completely vindicated in their long-standing confidence in American reliability over British speed and sophistication. Cromwell crews urgently advocated for the extensive modifications that would eventually make their tanks combat-worthy. Centaur crews expressed obvious relief, learning their problematic tanks wouldn't face German armor in battle. All understood they'd witnessed something genuinely momentous. A definitive test proving beyond argument that reliability surpassed every other single characteristic in armored vehicles. Major General Richardson's closing statement in the Exercise Dracula report merits remembering. It is evident that the commander of a unit equipped with Shermans can be genuinely confident of taking 99% of his vehicles into battle, at least during their first 2,000 miles of operational life. On the other hand, if he were equipped with Cromwells or Centaurs, he would be in a continuous state of anxiety about whether enough tanks would actually reach the battlefield to carry out the normal tasks expected of his unit. This straightforward assessment, grounded in objective testing data from the most thorough examination conducted, clarified convincingly why British armor divisions continued depending on American-supplied tanks, even after improved British designs theoretically became available. Reliability wasn't merely desirable or convenient. It was absolutely fundamental to military effectiveness. The enhanced Cromwell, eventually emerging from Exercise Dracula and subsequent extensive modifications, became genuinely capable for its intended reconnaissance function. The improvements brought reliability to acceptable levels for sustained operations, though not quite matching Sherman performance in every category. It served effectively in its specialized role as a fast reconnaissance machine, exploiting tactical opportunities. Yet it never replaced the Sherman as Britain's primary cruiser tank, because necessary modifications arrived too late, and production numbers remained dwarfed by Sherman quantities. The chance to equip British armor divisions entirely with domestically manufactured tanks had permanently vanished. Americans had built the superior tank, not through cleverer individual engineering, but through fundamentally better industrial philosophy prioritizing reliability. The striking difference between American and British tank development during World War II reflected deeper industrial culture and national priorities diverging significantly. American industry enthusiastically embraced mass production doctrine, aggressive standardization, and reliability engineering as foundational principles. British industry preserved traditional craft production values, emphasizing custom quality, individual excellence, and cutting-edge performance in every unit created. For luxury peacetime consumer goods, British methods consistently delivered excellence, commanding premium prices. For military equipment that absolutely required reliable performance under worst imaginable conditions, American methods proved decisively superior. The Sherman defeated the Cromwell not in impressive specifications or theoretical metrics, but in muddy battlefields where only reliability determined whether tanks fought or collapsed. Exercise Dracula ranks among modern military history's most significant yet surprisingly obscure comparative tests. It supplied genuinely objective information comparing major Allied tank designs under carefully controlled yet realistic circumstances. It forced uncomfortable but necessary British recognition of systematic deficiencies in tank development programs. It directly shaped critical procurement decisions, materially influencing Northwest Europe's campaign. Most importantly, it demonstrated an essential truth military institutions still struggled accepting fully. Reliability matters more than performance specifications. Simplicity consistently defeats sophistication. The tank running reliably wins decisively over impressive technical specifications that fail repeatedly in practice. The 2,000 miles methodically covered during exercise, Dracula revealed at acceptable resource cost what actual combat would have demonstrated at vastly higher human cost. The Cromwell simply wasn't prepared for frontline service in its August 1943 condition. The necessary modifications required considerable time developing and implementing properly across production facilities. The Sherman, thoroughly battle-proven in North Africa, Sicily, and increasingly in Italy, could be absolutely trusted performing under sustained operational stress. British commanders faced not whether they personally preferred British or American tanks. They faced whether they wanted dependably functioning tanks or repeatedly failing machines. The comprehensive test made that choice obviously clear to anyone willing objectively examining the data. Viewing Exercise Dracula from more than 80 years later, the test provides military procurement lessons remaining strikingly relevant today. It demonstrates convincingly that realistic testing under actual operational circumstances matters more than theoretical performance figures from controlled laboratory trials. It establishes that reliability engineering deserves priority, matching or exceeding performance engineering in weapon system advancement. It proves fundamental industrial philosophy matters as profoundly as individual design creativity. It reminds us the most critical characteristic of any military equipment is simply functioning when desperately required, not how impressive it appears in glossy specification sheets or promotional material. The Sherman completing 2,000 miles with minimal maintenance during exercise, Dracula subsequently fought across Europe, making vital contributions to Allied victory. The Cromwell requiring more than double the maintenance endured many months of intensive modifications before becoming combat serviceable. The Centaur, performing worst of all, got relegated to training roles and specialized conversions. These dramatically different fates weren't determined by crew courage or designer skill or theoretical engineering sophistication. They were determined fundamentally by reliability, the decidedly unglamorous quality mattering most when complex machines operate under sustained stress. Exercise Dracula answered decisively the question British commanders desperately needed answered. Could the Cromwell replace the Sherman as Britain's primary cruiser tank? The comprehensive test provided a clear, unambiguous, data-driven response. No, not yet, not until extensive modifications substantially improved reliability to genuinely acceptable levels for sustained combat. That honest answer directly shaped British armoured doctrine through the war's remainder and influenced post-war tank development philosophy for decades. It represented an expensive lesson in time and resources, but one learned through systematic testing rather than preventable combat casualties. The 2,000 miles of Exercise Dracula ultimately protected British lives by preventing premature, unreliable tank deployment that would have failed catastrophically when most desperately needed. Exercise Dracula's final irony revealed decisive American superiority precisely where Britain had longest taken greatest pride. British engineering enjoyed worldwide fame for exceptional quality and technical sophistication. British industry had originally spearheaded the global industrial revolution in the 19th century. British wartime innovation produced radar, operational jet engines, and innumerable advanced technologies. Yet American industry, relentlessly emphasizing reliability and efficient mass production over traditional craftsmanship and sophisticated performance, manufactured fundamentally superior tanks. The Sherman succeeded through American industrial efficiency and practical philosophy, not British-style engineering brilliance. That lesson cut deeply into British pride, yet remained absolutely necessary for military effectiveness. Exercise Dracula addressed far more than tank comparison. It examined competing engineering and manufacturing philosophies. It highlighted the crucial distinction between impressive paper performance and genuine practical functionality. It revealed the genuine military value of unglamorous reliability against exciting performance's seductive appeal. The test demonstrated conclusively that in warfare, as in life generally, simply arriving matters more than arriving impressively fast. The Sherman arrived consistently. The Cromwell, too, frequently did not. That fundamental difference made all the difference between ultimate victory and defeat.